So fine. So I guess Rodney has been working with us here at the San Fernando Valley Audubon Society for a couple of years now. The Institute for Bird Populations is a long-term environmental group that I think, if you correct me if I'm wrong, I think you really got your core of your activities was banding and collecting banding data as a pre eBird version of finding out where birds are. But even better, when birds are banded, you get weight and their physiological details, how healthy they are, where they are, and by the date you kind of get where they are in their life cycle. I think that continues to be the case. I'm hoping to hear that I can come in and mine that data. I can look up where banding has been done. I can say, okay, how many great gray owls have been banded and where were they and what was the purpose of banding them? And so maybe, I don't think you want to go into that during your talk, but I'm hoping to learn how to do that myself. I think a more evolved part of bird population, or IBP, is helping government, park, other organizations evaluate environment for birds. And I think the case study you're going to hear tonight is kind of a typical thing. There's a Park Service wants to know is it managing in the grounds appropriately for the health and safety of the wildlife that's in that area. And I'm sure that Rodney will give you the details of that. We actually got started with a project to piggyback on a Forest Service project with flammulated owls, and extend the environmental evaluation that was happening there and try to track out the migration path of those owls. And then I guess it's, pardon me if I got it wrong, I think it's the Forest Service decided that they were going to do something else. And so our intention to tag some flammulated owls to follow their migration got shut down. And Rodney contacted us and said, hey, there's this great study with great gray owls in Yosemite, and we really could stand some support for that. So there are a number of organizations, including other Audubon chapters, and I believe there's the Teton Raptor Center and others besides the Yosemite National Park, that are trying to evaluate what's best, particularly for great gray owls in this case, but I'm sure that there's other management decisions that need to be made. So I'm hoping you can fill us in on that. And I'm excited to hearing the details. I'm looking forward to seeing science in the effort to conserve species like these great gray owls. So I leave it to you. Take over, share your screen. Welcome, Rodney. I appreciate you giving your time for us tonight.
Thank you, Richard. I appreciate it. That was a great introduction. Let me pull up my screen. Where am I? Okay. Be right with you.
Yeah, we're there.
Hey, can everyone see that? Are we good?
Looks good to me.
Wonderful. Well, thanks, Richard. That was a great introduction. I'm going to amplify on some of the themes that you brought up, but the accuracy of your narrative was spot on from my perspective. Hello, San Fernando Valley Audubon Society. It's great to be able to talk to you all tonight, especially about one of my absolute favorite bird species, the great gray owl. My own work with this species began back in 2001 when the Forest Service engaged IBP to conduct some great gray owl surveys on the Stanislaus National Forest. And I took on that project. At the time, I had never seen a great gray owl before, but it wasn't too long before I did. And the majesty of that bird really hooked me in. And 23 years later, I'm still hooked. That being said, I want to start tonight with a bit of a caveat that I'm not really a great gray owl specialist. I'm a generalist. I study Sierra Nevada birds primarily, but that's that covers a lot of different species and habitats. I've done field work with great gray owls kind of in fits and starts over the years. And along with colleagues, I've published a bunch of papers on their ecology and conservation, some of which I'm going to be talking about today. But there are researchers, including colleagues of mine on some of these papers, who have personally spent thousands of hours in the field looking for great gray owls, observing great gray owls, studying great gray owls. And I'm not one of those people. I've been fortunate enough to get out in the field with them a fair amount, but I'm not one of these really deep single species experts. So I just want to be clear on that from the beginning. So my plan for tonight is this. I figure some of you may be mostly or entirely unfamiliar with the Institute for Bird Populations. So I'm going to just quickly introduce us to give you a little bit of information about who we are. And then I'll pivot to owls as advertised. For the owls, I'm going to give a brief introduction to the ecology of the species, and then focus the rest of the evening specifically on its ecology and conservation here in California, relying heavily on research that I, along with colleagues, have published. I'll talk about habitat selection, which is somewhat distinctive in our California population, and then present some research on how the changing fire regime and climate change in general may be affecting our California great gray owls. Lastly, I'm going to talk about some ongoing great gray owl research that we're conducting right now, including a small project in the northern Sierra Nevada and especially a larger one in Yosemite National Park that you all helped to fund. And that's the one that Richard was talking about. So the Institute for Bird Populations, or IBP, was founded in 1989 by the late Dave DeSanti, who passed away now about a year and a half ago. We are a nonprofit research and conservation organization based here in Petaluma in the San Francisco Bay Area, with a mission of enabling science-based conservation of species and habitats by studying the abundance, demography, and ecology of birds and occasionally other wildlife. Our current staff includes 20 year-round employees, most of whom are full-time scientists. They're spread out across 11 states. And then during the spring and summer, when most of our field work is going on, we staff up our field crews with literally dozens of seasonal biologists. In fact, this year, I think we have about 70 seasonal biologists that are coming on board in the next month or two. As Richard was talking about, our most well-known project and the project that Dave DeSanti founded IBP to start is the Monitoring Avian Productivity and Survivorship, or MAPS program, which is a continent-wide network of bird banding stations that we coordinate. Now, while MAPS operates on the scale of the entire continent, almost, we also, as Richard was saying, conduct many other more locally oriented research, monitoring, and conservation projects, primarily, but not entirely, throughout the Western United States. In fact, our four main focal areas now are the Pacific Northwest, the Sierra Nevada, the American Southwest, and Pacific Islands, although occasionally, for various reasons, we'll pursue some work in another region. You can learn more about us at birdpop.org. And if you like what you're doing, please consider supporting our work with a tax-deductible donation. We are a 501c3 nonprofit. Okay, I'm going to talk about owls now. So measured tip to tail, great gray owl is North America's largest owl. Though in fairness to snowy owl and great horned owl, it's not the largest by body mass nor size of the feet, which is really the business end of the owl. Nevertheless, the stature, along with all those feathers and all that floof, add to the majesty of an already very large bird and really make an unforgettable impression when you see them. That impression is augmented by the really imposing face. For ID purposes, note the yellow eyes, the yellow bill, and the distinctive black and white bow tie that the adult birds wear. Now, the fledglings don't have the bow tie. They're also distinguishable from other large owl species that are around by characteristics including the overall gray color, plus yellow eyes and yellow bill. And that's a great gray owl fledgling on the far left, and a great horned owl fledgling in the middle, and a spotted owl fledgling on the right. In California, great gray owls eat primarily voles and pocket gophers. That's the vast majority of their diet. But they have been documented to eat all sorts of things when opportunities come up, including deer mice, moles, shrews, rabbits, squirrels, chipmunks, small birds, and lizards. Those are all the things I could find records of in any case. Great gray owl is a holarctic species, meaning that it occurs at high latitudes across the globe, not just in North America. The owls inhabit boreal forests from Scandinavia across Russia to northern Mongolia and China, and across Alaska and Canada, down to the Rocky Mountains, the Pacific Northwest, and most southerly, the Sierra Nevada, which is indeed the southernmost extension of their range by a lot. Here in California, they likely encounter environmental conditions that are really quite distinct from anywhere else in their range because it is so much further south. And that's a topic that I'll come back to a little later in the talk. So the core of the California population is generally considered to be the western slopes of the Sierra Nevada, particularly in Yosemite National Park and in the adjacent Stanislaus National Forest and Sierra National Forest. So in 2015, my colleagues and I at IBP compiled all the known records of nest or recently fledged birds that were likely still near their nest in California. Although clearly centered around Yosemite, the records actually extend a bit further than that to the north and the south, from El Dorado County to the boundary of Fresno and Tulare counties in the south. Plus, as you can see here, at least one outlier way up in Modoc County. Like I said, these data were compiled in 2015, and there are quite a few additional territories that have been found since then that are not in this map, especially in the El Dorado region. Also note that these are breeding records only. Great gray owls have been detected occasionally elsewhere in the state, including in the northern and eastern Sierra, and in the northwest corner of the state in Del Norte and even Humboldt counties. Based on these and other data, people generally think there are somewhere between 100 and 200 pairs of great gray owls in California. I think 200 is probably a substantial overestimate. I would put it more like 100 to 120 pairs, but we don't really know for sure. Now I'm going to talk a little bit about habitat use and habitat selection, again, all in California. Nest site availability has been suggested as a limiting factor for population growth in California, as a possible explanation for why the population of our California birds is so small. But information on nest types and nesting habitat was, until recently, based on a really small number of nests that may not have fully represented the variety of conditions used by the species in the state. Understanding the full range of nest site characteristics used by the species in California could really help land managers foster and maintain the full continuum of suitable nesting habitat. So back in 2015, we collated all the known nesting records in the Sierra Nevada from between 1973, the oldest good records we had, to 2014. We identified 56 sites with visually confirmed nesting records and coordinates that were sufficient to relocate the nest tree. I said 2015, but in 2014, we actually went and visited all of those sites that we could. We were able to get to 51 of the 56 sites and conduct on-the-ground habitat assessments, and in most cases, actually find and measure the nest tree, which in the majority of cases, even though some of the nesting records were pretty old, the nest tree was still there. A few of the nest trees were in various stages of decay or had even fallen to the ground, which is why in this table our sample sizes are a little different for each variable, because some variables we were able to conduct to collect from the partially deteriorated trees, and in others we weren't. But of the trees that we could measure, the average diameter or breast height was about 100 centimeters or 39 inches, which is a pretty big tree. Not so surprising given how big the owls themselves are. Another notable feature of the nest sites was quite dense canopy cover, which averaged about 82% over the immediate area around the nest. We also looked at the tree species that the owls were used for nesting. The largest share of the nest trees we assessed were red fir, followed closely by black oak. Other species that the owls used included ponderosa pine, lodgepole pine, valley oak, and one each of Douglas fir, and most surprisingly to me, gray pine. Note also this graph indicates not just the species of the nest tree, but also the proportion of nest trees of each species that were either alive or dead at the time of known use. And you can see here that nearly all of the conifers were dead when they were used, but the majority of the oaks were still alive. And this pattern makes sense when you look at the distribution of nest types. In the conifers, the nests were mostly in hollows that formed where the top of a dead tree had likely broken off in the wind, like the one pictured here. But in oaks, the birds most often use natural cavities that typically form when a large branch breaks off the main trunk, something that frequently happens to large old oaks without actually killing them. Here's an array of images of some of the diverse nest sites that we looked at in that study. On the top row from left to right, we see a broken top red fir snag that had a nest in the very top. A broken top ponderosa pine snag, again, that had a nest up at the top. And a lodgepole pine snag that was particularly interesting because, first of all, it was enormous. And secondly, it was in the middle of a patch of forest that had recently burned at high severity. Continuing along the top row, we see a ponderosa pine with a more complicated structure. And the nest was kind of in a crevice there in the sort of witch's broom structure at the middle of the trunk. Then in the second row, there's a living black oak with one of those very large cavities that I mentioned, followed by that gray pine, that cavity there near the bottom of the tree is where the owls were nesting. That cavity is actually, I don't know, 10 meters up the tree or something. And that was probably the largest gray pine that I've ever seen anywhere. It's probably an unusual circumstance for them to nest in that tree species. It was an opportunistic thing, I think. And then followed by, to the right, two more examples of nests in living oak trees. And then here's a bonus image. This actually is not a tree we were able to visit for the study, but this is a particularly unusual nest in a mistletoe broom in a ponderosa pine on the Modoc Plateau. Overall, the nest sites we assessed ranged in elevation from about 700 meters above sea level to 2,400 meters, or 2,300 feet up to 7,900 feet, which is a bigger range, particularly at the lower bound, than was understood until recently, which is on another topic I'll come back to in a few minutes. Those nest trees were embedded within a diversity of forest types, but most frequently Sierra mixed conifer, followed by red fir, white fir, lodgepole pine, and montane hardwood conifer. Like I mentioned before, great gray owl nests in California are typically near montane meadows where the owls do most of their foraging. These images were all taken close to known nests. Now, we got curious about how pervasive this association between nests and meadows is and how far from the meadow edge the nests typically are. So this graph shows the proportion of nests within various distances of wet montane meadows, broken out by elevation zones. Overall, lumping all of the elevation nests together, 72% of the nests were within 250 meters of a montane meadow. And among those nests, the average distance from the meadow edge was 101 meters. But at high elevations, shown here by the dashed line, the percentage of nests within 250 meters of the meadow edge was higher, and at lower elevations, shown by the solid line, it was lower. In fact, the x-axis here is truncated at 750 meters, but about a third of the low elevation nests were actually more than 750 meters from the nearest meadow. So we became increasingly interested in those low elevation owls, those birds that in many cases were nesting so far from wet meadows. And we ended up partnering with a biologist named Kevin Roberts at Sierra Pacific Industries to describe those particular nests and the nesting biology of the owls that are using them in more detail. Kevin started finding great gray owl nests in oak-dominated woodlands owned by Sierra Pacific Industries in Amador and El Dorado counties around 2006. And at that time, it was a big surprise that the owls were regularly and repeatedly using areas this low in elevation and often without a nearby wet meadow. We still don't know why no one had ever detected them previously. Were they always there in those low elevation habitats, at least in that area, but had just been really cryptic? Or did they only recently colonize that area? And this figure from the paper indicates where in California these lands I'm talking about are that are owned by Sierra Pacific Industries. The triangles indicate nests that were found between 2006 and 2014. In subsequent years, Kevin and his crew were able to find quite a few more nests. One question we had about these unexpected nests in oak-dominated lower elevation habitat is whether they were generally succeeding at fledging young. One possibility was that this was sink habitat, that for some reason was attracting the owls, but they generally were not succeeding in breeding there. So to assess this, we compared Kevin's terrific detailed observations, described in the top row in this table as lower montane, with nesting productivity values from other studies in North America. And in general, the productivity rates from these lower montane nests were at least as high as other studies elsewhere in North America, and even with a hint that they were actually higher than what the owl crew in Yosemite National Park had been observing. Our other goal with that analysis was not just to describe those nests, but also to characterize the habitat that the owls were using and then use maximum entropy modeling to identify other patches of similar habitat in the low elevation portion of the Sierra that might also support undiscovered great gray owl clusters.
Just trying to make sure.
I'm going to spare you the details of the modeling methodology, but here's the output. This is the juicy part. A Sierra-wide map of habitat similarity based on the variables that our modeling indicated were most predictive within our more limited study area. Basically, any color here other than dark blue indicates an area of low elevation Sierra habitat worth checking out for great gray owls. Unfortunately, for a lot of years, we tried but failed to secure funding to go out and search these areas. Although anecdotally, several additional nests that SPI found in later years seem to align well with our model. Nevertheless, the question remained, are there undiscovered clusters of great gray owls elsewhere in the region? We don't know, but it sure seems possible. And happily, this year, we have at least some opportunity to go out and look for them. And I'll talk a little bit about that near the end of the talk. The other thing I wanted to point out here is that our model was trained on data from our limited study area in the northern half of the Sierra. And that may be why it didn't identify any real habitat similarity hotspots in the southern portion of the Sierra. I think there may be some good low elevation habitat in the southern Sierra that is worth more systematically exploring for great gray owls, but our model is just not recognizing it because it's too different from habitat in the north. Okay, I'm going to move on now, shift gears and talk about some of the work we've done to investigate how our changing wildfire patterns might be affecting great gray owls. This was a collaboration among IBP and many other partners, particularly National Park Service, USDA Forest Service, and Sierra Pacific Industries, who all combined data from disparate survey efforts so that we could analyze the survey data together. But first, let me just take a step back. I'm sure everybody's aware the fire regime in California. The fire regime in California has been changing dramatically in recent years. Our 2022 and 2023 fire seasons were relatively mild compared to recent years. They're not on this graph. But over the last decade or more, there's been a clear trend toward increasing area burned, particularly in the Sierra Nevada. Much of the increase in burned acreage has been due to the increasing frequency of so-called mega fires, which burn really large areas in a single fire event. One of these mega fires, the 2013 Rim Fire, burned about 250,000 acres in the central Sierra Nevada, really in the heart of great gray owl's California range. Now, to step back a bit, we know that forest birds in general exist on really a spectrum of vulnerability to fire. Some species indicated on the right here are more or less dependent on late cereal forest characteristics and are therefore probably vulnerable to fire. But other species, represented by those on the left here, may thrive in the years, or even decades after fire. So it's not super clear where we should expect great gray owls to fall on this continuum. We know they need big trees and they need close canopy cover, which may make them vulnerable to wildfire, but we also know that they nest in snags, which can be created in large numbers by fire. In fact, here's an anecdotal example from before the Rim Fire. This was a successful great gray owl nest in a giant lodgepole pine snag in Yosemite National Park. Those young owls had just branched from their nest in the very top of the main trunk. But coming back to the Rim Fire, as you can see, it burned like a bullseye on the center of the Sierra Nevada great gray owl population. In some areas, the Rim Fire killed vast expanses of trees. But in other parts of the landscape, this was less true, especially on the margins of meadows, where generally wetter conditions seem to afford some protection and left pockets of intact forest canopy. So we compiled existing survey data from great gray owl surveys that the various agencies had conducted at 144 meadows that were all surveyed at least once between 2004 and 2016. Now remember, the Rim Fire occurred in 2013. So I'm just going to orient you with this figure. The dark green polygon is Yosemite National Park, and the adjacent light green area is Stanislaus National Forest. And then the blob there in various shades of purple is the footprint of the 2013 Rim Fire. Each of the circles represents a meadow that was surveyed at least once between 2004 and 2016. And the circles are bisected. So the left half of the circle indicates results from any surveys that were conducted prior to the Rim Fire in 2013, so between 2004 and 2013. If the left half is white, then that meadow was never surveyed in that time period. If the left half is gray, it was surveyed, but no great gray owls were detected. And if the left half is black, then great gray owls were detected during surveys at that site in those 9 years prior to the fire. The right half indicates the 3 years, 2014 through 2016, with the colors indicating the same things, whether the survey occurred, and if so, whether owls were detected, great gray owls specifically. So on the right side here, I've just blown up the image in the red box on the left side to give you a closer look at it. And just in general, what you can see, in most cases, if a great gray owl within the fire perimeter had been detected at a site prior to the rim fire, and then that site had been surveyed again after the rim fire, the great gray owls were still there. But of course, we wanted to evaluate this more rigorously. So we put all those data into a Bayesian hierarchical model to assess occupancy rates before and after the fire, and to identify covariates that might help explain the results. So panel A here provides really our summary results, pulling all the data from the meadows inside and outside the fire perimeter, all those circles on the previous slide. We found that the proportion of occupied meadows prior to the fire was quite steady, but then rather than decreasing, it actually increased after the fire. When we disaggregated the sites by whether they were inside or outside the fire, shown here in panel B, we found nearly identical results. It didn't make any difference. When we disaggregated the sites by land ownership in panel C, comparing sites on Park Service land versus Forest Service or private land, we found that the occupancy rates were higher on Park Service land, but that the overall trends were the same. After the fire, occupancy was similar or higher than prior to the fire. And then we also looked at annual probability of colonization, which is the probability that a site that was vacant 1 year became occupied the next year, and also the probability of persistence, which is the probability of that a site that was occupied 1 year was also occupied the next year. And in both cases, the rates were steady or increased after the fire in 2013. So what does all that mean? Well, it seems like the bottom line is that the owls were quite resilient to what seemed like a worst case fire scenario that actually at the time had people wondering if we were going to lose great gray owls from California because of that fire. Now, it was a curious finding that populations were doing so well both inside and outside the fire perimeter. So it's possible that factors unrelated to the fire, like annual weather variation, may have caused those post-fire increases or contributed to them. But at the very least, the fire did not prevent that from happening. So does this mean that perhaps fire is not a major threat to this population? I mean, our data suggests that, but a big caveat is that this was a very short-term assessment. We were only looking at occupancy rates in the 3 years after fire. It's certainly possible that the owls that already had territories within the burned area returned to those territories, but perhaps were not very successful reproducing there. And it's also possible that over the long term, as a lot of the snags that were created by that fire come down, that the nesting opportunities are going to be reduced greatly. But I will say we have anecdotal information that there was plenty of nesting going on at those sites during those years. Most of those surveys were not finding nests and collecting reproductive data. Nevertheless, in several instances, crews did come across fledglings or even nests that were near fledging. So there did seem to be ample reproduction going on, but again, we were not able to evaluate that quantitatively. So now I want to switch gears again from one possible population stressor, wildfire, to climate change more broadly, which may stress great gray owl populations in California in all sorts of ways, ranging from the pervasive forest die-offs that we saw in the past decade throughout the Sierra Nevada due to drought, to changing meadow moisture patterns due to earlier snow melt that's occurring. The findings I'm going to summarize now are part of a paper by my IBP colleagues and me that projects future habitat availability for California's great gray owls out to the end of the century in the context of predicted climate change. The modeling methods are more complex than probably people want to listen to at 8 o'clock on a Tuesday night, or a Thursday night. So I'm just going to give a very abbreviated description of them here and kind of focus on the take-home results. We used a method called boosted regression tree models to describe recent and current habitat favorability for great gray owls in the Sierra Nevada, and then apply those models to projected climate data under a high emissions scenario. The output was a prediction of future habitat suitability, with the goal of identifying sites that might be important to conserve both in the present and throughout the rest of the century for great gray owls. For all the meadows where great gray owls have been detected since the 1970s, we gathered geophysical data like soil type and slope, and climate data like average precipitation and temperature, and then produced a model that identified the combinations of those values that yielded occupied sites in recent times. We then predicted which meadows would have those combinations of values throughout the rest of the century under projected climate change scenarios. So the map on the left here shows the actual locations of sites that were occupied since the 1970s that inform the model. The middle figure is the map of sites that the model then predicts should currently have good habitat. Basically, the similarity between the middle figure and the map at the left tells us how well the model is performing. And it's pretty good. If you look at the map on the right, though, those are the meadows that the model predicts will have favorable habitat during the period 2070 to 2099. So as you can see, the number of meadows that we presume would be good for great gray owls is greatly reduced during that time frame. The sites are more tightly clustered, and generally they tend to be a bit higher up in the mountains than the sites are today. So what does that all that mean? Well, we did. I'll start with a few caveats. We did not assess the capacity of owls to adapt to conditions that they are not currently experiencing. So that's a big unknown. Maybe they have some adaptive capacity to be able to use sites outside of the envelope of conditions that they're currently using. We just don't know that. Nevertheless, climate change seems likely to render unsuitable many of the meadows that currently are suitable, but also to make some suitable that are currently not suitable. So it's going to, seems it will remove habitat, but also bring online, if you will, new habitat that'll be appropriate for the owls. However, suitability does not ensure that new sites will actually be colonized by owls. It just means that if they were to get there, our model suggests the owls could thrive there. On balance, though, it seems like the owls are going to lose suitable habitat over the coming decades, making conservation efforts for the species even more important. For the last section of my talk tonight, I want to give you just a very brief preview of some IBP research on great gray owls that is underway right now. The first one is a small project, but it's one I'm really pleased about because we've been trying to get traction on it for years now. And this is a follow-up effort to look for great gray owls in some of those lower elevation forests that we identified as being potential habitat based on the habitat modeling work that I described earlier, based on that map there on the right. This project is funded by the Bureau of Land Management and also your counterparts in the Sierra Foothills Audubon Society. And it's focused on surveying promising habitat primarily on Bureau of Land Management lands northeast of Sacramento. So for this project, we're making use of autonomous recording units, or ARUs, to detect the owls, which IBP biologists Dr. Mary Clapp and Helen Laughlin are shown here while were deploying the ARUs just a few weeks ago. Although the project is limited in scope, it's just exciting that we're finally being able to make some inroads into testing this model, and who knows, maybe finding some more great gray owls in these lower elevation forests than we are currently aware of. And then the last project I want to talk about, again, just briefly, is an ongoing collaboration between IDP, Yosemite National Park, and the Teton Raptor Center, funded by Yosemite Conservancy, and with much gratitude from me, all of you at San Fernando Valley Audubon. Actually, go back. So this is the study of great gray owl movement ecology, space use, and habitat selection in Yosemite National Park. Yosemite is planning and initiating some ambitious meadow restoration efforts, which are likely to affect foraging conditions for its great gray owls, perhaps in ways that are both good and bad. So we sought to describe fine-scale habitat selection by the owls in the park's meadows and identify preferred habitat characteristics at a micro scale for hunting and roosting. Like, we wanted to know specifically which conditions even of a given meadow were the owls favoring or avoiding, because many of these large meadows really have a variety of conditions across the scope of the meadow. We could then, we hope, use those findings to advise land managers in the park and beyond on owl-friendly meadow restoration. And then the other thing spurring this project was that there's ongoing work by Yosemite land managers aimed at reducing fire risk in the park by controlling vegetation along roadways, which in some cases pass right through known great gray owl foraging areas. And this is a big deal because vehicle strikes, it turns out, are a major cause of great gray owl mortality in California, especially within the park. We're aware of dozens of great gray owls in California that have been killed by vehicle collisions in recent decades, including many within Yosemite. And in fact, we compiled and mapped all of these known collisions about 8 years ago. There have been numerous collisions since, I'm sorry to say, but this map shows the collisions that were the reported collisions that we were able to compile. So identifying frequent road crossing points where the roads in Yosemite do cross through great gray owl territories. We wanted to know where are the great gray owls actually crossing the roads, and also more importantly, determining which vegetation characteristics encourage or discourage use of roadside areas by the owls. And with that information, our hope is that we can help land managers tailor the roadside vegetation treatments to help the owls avoid getting hit by cars in the future. So, get at these questions. We GPS tagged 5 owls in Yosemite in the spring of 2022, and then track them to study fine-scale habitat selection and movement patterns. So, pictured here, besides that gorgeous owl, are IBP biologist Ramiro Aragon and Teton Raptor Center biologist and great gray owl expert extraordinaire, Dr. Catherine Gura, that are GPS tagging that particular owl. The tags collected location fixes on a variety of schedules, but the really exciting thing is that it's all automated, and so they capture enormous amounts of data. And I'll give you a little bit of detail on that in just a moment. The data were downloaded remotely from a handheld base station throughout the time the owls were being tracked, which could be done without having to recapture the owl. And the last GPS tag was just removed from the last owl last week. So that owl had been wearing its GPS tag and collecting data for us for just under 2 years. So we also conducted vegetation surveys at hundreds of plots around observed use points. And then we also compiled and are still compiling remote sense data on forest structure and other habitat variables that will help us explain the movement and species patterns of these five focal individuals. So we're not very far along on data analysis yet. Like I said, that last tag just came off last week. But I just wanted to show you, here are the point clouds from 2 of the 5 owls, showing really the 2 extremes in home range size that we observed. The first thing you'll notice about these is that there's a lot of points. And in fact, we have nearly 53,000 fixes on these 5 owls over a 2-year period. But looking at these 2 particular home ranges, note the 2 contrasting scale bars. Throughout its annual cycle, the owl on the right mostly stayed put in a home range with about a 1.5-mile radius that was more or less centered on where the owl had nested. And in contrast, the owl on the left shifted its home range greatly throughout the annual cycle, leaving its breeding area in the late fall and using other areas up to 10 miles away from where it nested. So like I said, we're just beginning a quantitative analysis of these data, but some fun surprises have already jumped out even before we've done that. One is that in Yosemite, 2 meadows about 3 miles apart that have long been known to be occupied by great gray owls. We always assume they represented 2 distinct pair of owls. And one of our good surprises, or one of our interesting surprises, was that it turned out that at least in 2022 and 2023, it was 1 pair of owls that was commuting between these 2 sites about 3 miles apart and foraging at both of them. Another interesting surprise, one of the tagged owls that nested in one of Yosemite's most lush, beautiful meadows surprised us by frequently foraging a couple of miles away outside the park along a heavily trafficked highway. Perhaps not the best judgment. It must have been going there for some good reason. And we'd kind of like to hope we can get at that and figure that out. But there's some interesting conservation lessons there, I think, about having to really know where your species is going. And then lastly, I just think it's interesting that even among this very small group of the small sample size, just 5 tracked owls, we had 2 birds that more or less stayed put all year. And then we had 2 birds that moved downslope quite a bit in winter. And then we had 1 that actually surprised everybody by departing its breeding area and moving upslope, actually going a couple of thousand feet higher and spending most of the winter in higher elevation forest. So we had no idea that a great gray owl would do that, and we don't know why yet. So like I said, the data analyses are in progress, so stay tuned. I will try to report back to you all about that. That's essentially the end of my presentation. I hope you find great gray owls as majestic and intriguing as I do. But I do want to end on a cautionary note, which is that these birds can be quite sensitive to disturbance by recreational birders and photographers. There's at least 1 well-documented instance of overly aggressive birders possibly causing a nest failure in Yosemite. So, in the words of the great David Gaines, author of a classic book on the birds of Yosemite, let's leave these great owls in peace, shun their nest sites and roosts, and observe, if at all, from discreet distances. Let us treat them with the respect and reverence that they deserve. So I hope you'll keep this in mind if you go looking for great gray owls, which I do encourage you to do. Just do it respectfully, and especially be careful during the breeding season. So lastly, I want to thank all of my wonderful great gray owl research colleagues. Most of my co-authors on those papers are listed on the left there. And of course, I want to thank San Fernando Valley Audubon Society, as well as Richard in particular for all the support you guys have given to this work. And I'm going to stop sharing there.
So Marianne, you have been collating questions. Are you ready to give your results? Uh-oh.
Did we lose Marianne?
I don't know. I thought she was on board. Well, maybe I can put a couple of my questions forward um, while she gets her notes together. Um, I guess the one of most interest to our crowd tonight is you showed some of your team putting a tag on one of the great gray owls, and one of those people had a great sweatshirt on. Can we buy that shirt?
I've forgotten what oh, was he wearing an IBP sweatshirt? Is that what it was?
Well, no, it was a big picture of a great gray owl on the front.
Oh gosh, I gotta look at that. I've forgotten.
It's very cool.
I didn't know where that came from. I'll try to find out for you.
Okay.
Cool.
Okay.
All right.
All right. So I've got these questions here. I didn't realize that my mic had died as well as my video. So sorry about that.
I'm glad
Okay.
you're back.
Yeah. Well, anyway. All right. We had a lot of questions tonight. So here we go. Carolyn West asked, how many of your seasonal biologists are paid, and how many are there, and how many volunteers do you have?
Yeah, great question. So we've been growing a lot in recent years. So that answer is dynamic through time. This year we have about 70 seasonals, which is the most we've ever had. But the other change that we've been making in the early years of IBP, going back as far as 30 years, most of our field crews were volunteers, were full-time volunteers, and we have initially gradually and now rapidly been shifting away from that staffing model. It's still great to have volunteer engagement where it makes sense, but we've had a lot of criticism in the birding and ornithological community that this kind of model is contrary to encouraging diversity and inclusion in the field, that by relying so much on unpaid labor for kind of entry-level positions, we were creating, or at least perpetuating, barriers to entry into ornithology by less privileged people. And we take that very seriously. And so we've been, everywhere possible, we've been shifting over to paid positions. So this year, I think of those 70, we probably have 15 to 20 that are full-time volunteers and 45 or 50 that are paid. I think that's right. Something like that.
Pretty good. Okay. Marion asked if there was a preferred height for the nests.
Oh yeah, no, that's a great question. I think it's in my, I'm going to pull up my, maybe I should share my screen again because I believe it's in one of those slides. Let's see here. Going back in. Ding, 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 ding. Slow. There we go. Let's see, right over here. Here we go. So the tree height is in the middle row there. So the average height was 18 meters. And the average height of the nest, which may or not have been at the top of the tree, depending on the nest structure, was 14 meters. So they're not that high, right? That's, what is that, 30 feet or something? No, it's more than that. 40, closer to 50 feet, right?
60 feet, 18 meters.
The 14 meters for the nests, right?
Oh, okay.
So yeah. So relatively high.
50
in some cases they're literally at the treetops in those broken top conifers, but some of the nests in the oaks are quite a bit lower.
Okay. All right. Carolyn also asked, does Sierra Pacific Industries harvest trees?
They do harvest trees. They are a timber company. That is what they do.
Okay.
I will say they've have a very good track record in recent decades of protecting oaks. So that's one element that's well protected. But yeah, they're absolutely a timber company.
Okay. All right. Rick Krymans asked, nesting looks to be pretty exclusively on the western side. Why not on the eastern?
Yeah, what a great question. I wish I knew the answer. The eastern forests, it may have to do with less canopy cover. A lot of the nests or the forest are thinner in many cases with more openings. Maybe it's about winter snow conditions. We don't really know. I mean, we haven't had a good sense ever of what restricts great gray owl range in California, and I don't think I have any new answers to that. I think we're kind of figuring out like why they use the sites that they do within their range as opposed to other sites within their range, but we don't really know like why they aren't more spread out than that. So I don't have a good answer. And I'm open to theories if people have them.
Fine. Richard asked, some birds have shown genetic subpopulations, have shown varying susceptibility to environmental stressors. Is that true for the great grays?
Yeah, there's definitely indications that it may be. Interesting with the genetics of great gray owls. So great gray owls in California have been proposed to be recognized as a subspecies. There was some genetic work done, I guess we're going back about 10 years now, I think, by people out of UC Davis and the Forest Service that proposed the recognition of the Yosemitensis great gray owl subspecies. And it hasn't really gained traction. So the national, subspecies lists and things like that are maintained have not adopted it. But that group felt that there was enough evidence to consider it a distinct subspecies. And certainly the conditions sure are different. The environmental conditions that the birds, experience are really quite different than what birds are experiencing elsewhere in the range. A lot of the habits of the birds are really different. The woman I showed you, Catherine Gura, who was helping us tag the bird, she did her PhD on just recently on great gray owls in Wyoming and Montana. And the behaviors of those birds are just quite different. Most of the birds that she studies are nesting in old raven or goshawk nests, for example. And that's only been documented a couple of times in California. It's not their usual habit, even though, of course, we do have goshawk and raven nests. So those are options for them, but they just don't select them. So there seem to be all sorts of differences between our California birds and the more northerly populations.
I take this moment to ask you to unshare your screen so that we get
to sure.
All your glory there.
There we go. Thank you.
All right. Richard had a follow-on question, which was, where did it go? Oh, there it is. So you have assessed great gray populations in your study area. How well are these populations reflected in more general surveys like eBird and the Breeding Bird Survey?
Yeah, so great gray owls are really cryptic. They're not easy to detect. They're quiet. They do a lot of their vocalizing really late at night. So generally, multi-species surveys do not successfully pick them up. Certainly, surveys during the day are not going to do well. The breeding bird surveys, in our region are conducted in late May, early June, and that's already quite late into the breeding season. The owls are not spontaneously vocalizing very much at that point. So part of I think the mystery around the habitats and even the numbers of it present of the species is that they really do require focused survey effort to detect.
Okay. Pat Bates asked about, let's see if I understand the question, but Pat, you may have to clarify for me. Roadkill or fast food at heavily traveled highways? I'm not.
Yeah, so I imagine she's asking if the owls are foraging on roadkill the way that ravens do, or actually many other birds do. I'm not aware of gray owls doing that. I've never heard of them doing that. I think the issue more is that they are perching on attractive perching structures that are really close to roads, like fences, like fence posts, other kinds of objects along roads, and they're perhaps even foraging along in the grassy areas that are maintained right along road edges that are often kept free of shrubs to reduce fire risk. So those may be quite good foraging areas for small mammals, and they tend to swoop low. The way a great gray owl forages, usually they start out from a low perch and they scan a pretty small local area from that perch, and you can watch them with their heads moving, looking around. And then they'll fly off the perch and stoop down to the ground and do a long, low flight and try and pick up a prey item and then fly off low. And so there's a whole easily tens of meters section of the flight there where they could be hit by a car if they're right along a roadside.
Maladaptive behaviors.
Exactly.
Well, I'm intimidated by your swoop, so I'm backing up a bit here.
Right.
Okay, Carolyn West asks, any ability to see variations in nesting or habitat use based on the age of the birds?
Oh, what a interesting question. So we actually have a paper that we published just a couple years ago on aging great gray owls. We have some of you may know or know of Peter Pyle, who is a biologist who is an expert in molt in North American birds, and particularly aging and sexing birds by plumage. And so he and I worked on this. There was he went to specimens as well as photographic records of some detections of great gray owls in far northwestern California, in Humboldt and Del Norte counties, and basically he put together a bunch of evidence to get better at determining the age of great gray owls. That he figured out that with good wing images, if you can really see the wing either from a carcass or from a photo of a captured bird with an extended wing, you can age the birds all the way up to now I'm embarrassed, I'm forgetting how far along, but even it may have been up through fourth year, fifth year, but even that, after that, you can't age them anymore. So unless you have a marked population of birds that say were banded, as nestlings that you've been following for decades, you don't know how old your birds are. You just know if they've reached that fully adult stage in their plumage or not. But it's a good question, and there may be populations elsewhere where people have looked at that. I don't know.
Carolyn Oppenheimer asked if great gray owls still nest after a big fire. Do they still find the same kind of prey to feed the chicks? Aren't the voles they feed on killed off by the fire?
So what I think we're seeing is that the wetter meadows are pretty good safe harbors for the small mammals, even as fire roars through. Probably a lot of them die, but enough of them seem to stay alive to maintain populations even after a lot of the meadow edge and some of the willows in the middle of the meadow burn. But we find in the wetter parts of the meadow, the fire generally skips over it, or at least doesn't get deep into the vegetative area, the vegetative matter. So I'm sure there are exceptions to that. I'm sure there are drier meadows that sometimes really do fully torch. But for sure, some of the meadows we looked at in the rimfire area were still islands of wet green, even in late 2013, a few months after the fire.
Okay. All right.
That's great. Thank you very much. I don't know, Kathy, if you're around and you want to offer any closing remarks. I thought it was great, Rodney. I'm planning on contacting you more about accessing the bird banding data and t-shirt sales. And I hope we can see more of you as the study progresses. Really
Wonderful. Thank you. I really appreciate the opportunity. I appreciate the support and the opportunity to tell you about our activities.
Okay, good.
Well, let me finish up by saying we're thrilled to be able to support your research. It's important research. Having seen the great gray owls many years ago in a pine meadow in Yosemite, that was a thrill of a lifetime, I must say. And I hope we and our children and our children's children will have the opportunity to do the same. Thank you again. Thank you everyone for coming and enjoying our programming, and stay tuned for the next one. I'm sure good things are in the pipeline.
Okay, Rodney, just a little feed-off question from Kathy's remarks, and your remark about being careful with birding around great gray owls and her inspiration from seeing them. Is there any opportunity for like a guided walk to go to a good great gray owl nesting area and have a good opportunity to see them?
You know, there are natural history walks that are organized by organizations like the Yosemite Conservancy. There may be some, I think there are other programs that are directly organized by the Park Service there. We're actually, it's contractually prohibited from sharing data on great gray owl locations as part of our study, because that's sort of the level of worry about the birds there. So I'll talk to you, and I'll talk to you offline about this more, Richard. But I'll be putting you in touch with colleagues at the Park Service so that they can make the call about the proper way to do that.
Thank you. That'd be very nice. Thank you again. It's great to see some wonderful stuff going on. I look forward to talking with you more. Well, so good night, everyone. I will say end here. See you soon.
Thanks a lot.
Bye-bye.